hand over to Sophia. Sophia, could you sort of introduce yourself and a little bit about the work you've done? I know that you've just recently published a very influential survey.
Thank you so much for having me. My name's Sophia Gaston. I'm the director of the British Foreign Policy Group, which is a rather unusual foreign policy think tank, which is operating at the intersection between the domestic and the international. And my background is mainly as a social researcher, particularly specializing in public opinion. And I've been working on all of these destabilizing social forces within advanced liberal democracies and looking at them as a threat to governance and what can be done to unite countries and I suppose build a healthier public sphere. So we've been doing a lot of work into public opinion about all aspects of foreign policy, but that does include aid and development spending. We are doing more on this as well in the future. So we've been doing surveys and focus groups as well. So I just want to talk through 5 different things that I think are important to note about public opinion on aid and development, and then maybe we can get into more in the discussion later. So I think the first thing to note is just that public support for foreign aid and development spending is built on probably stronger foundations that may be visible from the media debate around this issue. And it might be more helpful to regard media coverage of foreign aid as kind of challenging around the margins rather than fundamentally questioning the value of all aid and development spending. The proportion of Brits who do not support foreign aid and development spending at all is quite low. Our survey puts this as of last month at 17%, which is, you know, a chunk of the population, but it's certainly by no means a majority or a large plurality. And so I think in this respect, we should be assuming a more confident position when having these kinds of discussions, because the impression of a fully divided nation is absolutely false. I think the second thing to note is that attitudes to aid and development spending are highly personalized. They reflect a range of different individual preferences, priorities, lived experiences. And I think it's therefore really crucial to appreciate that different issues and programs and regions and types of investments will be received and viewed differently on an individual basis. So we should not assume that aid and development spending is sort of seen as one single policy issue, but rather a suite of different issues. And also that sometimes there will be contradictions in these preferences, because we know that the UK's status as being a very generous nation, this is something that comes through really strongly in focus groups. It's incredibly important to Britain's sense of national identity and pride and sense of self, but there are often going to be a range of different competing emotions and instincts at play. The third thing is to provide an example of this, which is in the question of whether or not we should be making investments to support economic growth in developing nations. We find this is really the epicenter at which individual circumstances become critically important in shaping attitudes. So Britons from lower socioeconomic grades living in less prosperous parts of the country are much more likely to question this type of spending, undoubtedly because they consider their own standing within British society and perceive, you know, structural economic inequalities persist here. And so Britons make a quite fundamental distinction between promoting economic growth and alleviating poverty. And so this is the moment at which the kind of zero-sum game frame becomes very important and becomes activated. But equally, I would say as well that it's a mistake to consider this as something that applies to aid and development investments across the board. So we shouldn't, you know, be spooked by those sorts of figures that come into the question around economic growth. And my fourth point is another example of this. This is why we can see such huge groundswell of support for the UK reducing or ceasing our aid and development spending during the pandemic. Overall, survey last month finds that 72%, so nearly 3/4 of Brits support this. That's a reduction or a cessation, compared to 28% who think it should be maintained or increased. And I think it's important to note that there's some disagreement about the tests at which aid provision should be leveled back up. But I think the narrative of it being contingent on the UK's own economic recovery appears to be especially important. And again, that comes back to this sense of the point at which the zero-sum game becomes activated. And then finally, I would just also note that it's really important to say that the motivations behind Britain's support for foreign aid vary wildly. Many Britons are motivated by a moral argument, others by historical arguments, so it's our responsibility as a former imperial power. Others are driven by more strategic or more security-based impulses. And I think on the one hand, you can see this as a strength. It certainly means that there's a kind of degree of resilience in public opinion on foreign aid, so that it could foreseeably withstand any particular scandal or uproar. But equally, it also means that it's going to be rather difficult for the government to speak directly to the heart of the nation on aid, whether that's tugging at hearts or minds. So they're just 5 things I wanted to throw into the mix. But I would say that overall, I think the foundations are strong, but it's really important to look at everything in a much more nuanced way and not see public opinion on foreign aid and development as a kind of uniform, homogenous behemoth, or even just one single issue. It's I think, a much more complex picture than that. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. It's reassuring. I think we'll want to pick away at that a little bit as well. Could I bring in Lena, please?